Hey everybody, Dr. Rob Silverman here, Amazon best-selling author of Inside Out Health. Hope you all had a great weekend. A lot of requests for this topic. It's called metabolic flexibility. And it's an interesting topic in that I don't see it spoken about enough in the normal channels, enough in the functional medicine world. Metabolic flexibility is really interesting in that it, without question, is what we want. But what is metabolic flexibility? It's the ability of our cells to oxidize substrates for energy production based on nutrient availability and energy required to adjust for the metabolic demand. It's our ability of our metabolism to work more appropriately. As we all know, 42% of Americans are obese, 75% of Americans are overweight or obese. Only 12% of Americans are metabolically healthy and active. So within that 12%, we all should strive, not with just the 12%, but only that 12% right now has the ability for metabolic flexibility. I'm a big believer that our ability or our metabolic flexibility ability will be a leading indicator for overall health. We talked about balance. Well, what kind of balance? Balance to adjust metabolic demand. Let's look at a couple of different ideas about fasting and feeding. We all know that when we eat, nutrients are coming in, but now with the advent of intermittent fasting and time-restrictive eating, we're really seeing that we can't be eating all day. That 5 meal a day, eating every 3 hours towards the end of the day from the start to the finish of the day really isn't appropriate. It doesn't work. So the time-restrictive eating really works. So there's that fasting and feeding. As everybody knows, I'm a big proponent of fasting every day from 14 to 16 hours and eating in a window every day of 8 to 10 hours. It leads you to have a lot of balance in your demand. It also leads you down a path, a very prodigious path of overall health promoting. There's also a belief in the dynamic balance between the variation of your meal composition. People are like, what can I eat for breakfast? So let's just say oatmeal and egg whites. All right, I want to eat that every day for the next 3 weeks. It doesn't make sense. You want the variation. You want to get different foods. Your body will get stale. Your body may even not like that food. It may start getting sensitive to that food. So I'm a big proponent of not necessarily eating the same foods all the time. Mix and match your foods. Also, what kind of balance does your body need to have good metabolic flexibility? Well, what about periods of physical activity? To be able to adapt to different levels of physical activity, whether it's steady state or high interval intense training, HIIT exercise, weights, body weights, non-body weight, cardio, etc. You want to be able to adapt. Your body's ability to adapt is a true sign of overall health. And of course, for me, environmental modifications, cold to heat. We've seen so many different things. My good friend Greg Robbins was just talking about on Friday, the ability to take cold showers and go into, I don't think he talked that much about going into an ice tub, but your ability to modify the environment, very hot environment, very cold environment. Your ability to adapt is a critical element because it's all about adaptability. If our bodies, our metabolism can adapt to different environments and different stresses, we're clearly going to be healthier. Also, there's some things that are proposed to impair in obese and chronic diseases. So metabolic inflexibility can lead us down a path of a higher incidence of type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and maybe the thing that we should talk about almost every day that probably is one of the biggest determinants of health in America, that would be metabolic syndrome. And the best way to achieve metabolic flexibility would be exercise. So my suggestion is everybody get up, get moving. I try and put in some exercise, half hour to 90 minutes every day during the week. Some form of exercise is critical for everybody's overall well-being. Now, what's interesting, and I really want to talk more about the fasting because fasting is so topical, it's hot, if you will. A lot of people ask me about the different types of intermittent fasting, time-restrictive eating. Well, what's interesting is one of the ones that are a little hotter in the conversation are alternate day fasting. And I'm not a big proponent of alternate day fasting. I think they do a good job on YouTube. The gentleman who talks about it really lights up the storm. He's very engaging. He looks fabulous, but I'm not a big proponent. I'm more of the time restrictive eating under the prefix of intermittent fasting, that time restrictive eating where you fast and feed during the day. But belly fat was shown to be extremely resistant to every other day fasting. And that was in Cell Reports of 2021. It just came out. The researchers found history of repeated fasting triggered preservation signaling pathways in the visceral fat. That visceral fat is the fat over your organs. It's in your viscera. And that fat is the most inflammatory fat that you're going to have in your body. It's not only inflammatory, it actually signals with your brain. It's a direct communicator with your brain. It goes through your blood-brain barrier. It stimulates different interleukins, and visceral fat is a critical element. Not only that, it's also a tremendous determinant of what kind of outcome you're going to have within the idea of COVID-19. So what they're finding is the belly fat is so resistant to every other day fasting that's shown in that study that can protect its energy source. It doesn't want to burn from this type of lifestyle change. And visceral fat typically, just so everybody knows, usually comes from a dietary change. So the idea of that belly fat being resistant to every other day fasting, this is why visceral fat can be resistant to weight loss after long periods of time. So you'll see a lot of people lose some weight, maybe lose some inches, but not make the change in the visceral fat. That every other day fasting has no benefit for visceral fat. However, what I've seen in my office, that time restrictive eating per day does. The research team very interestingly examined more than 8,500 proteins that were located in the fat deposits. Proteomics, it's a study of all proteins. It's a reaction under certain conditions. They used this technique, which allowed them to be alerted of some major cellular changes. So let's take a good look at that. Here were the outcomes. Interesting in that every other day fasting has depot-specific effects on the adipose proteome. This every other day fasting leads to suppression of lipolysis in the visceral white adipose tissue by repression of something called ADRB3. Mitochondrial content and fatty acid synthesis enzymes are higher in visceral adipose tissue after alternate day fasting. And ultimately, every other day fasting reduces inflammatory extracellular matrix components of that visceral fat. With all that being said, let me unpack that for you. The bottom line is it did not affect every other day fasting the visceral fat. So for me, even though there were some early studies on it, I would try to avoid it. Now, people ask, well, why do we fast? What is it about fasting that we like so very much? And for me, the real takeaway is a concept, and it's a very easy concept to wrap your head around: homeostasis. Homeostasis actually was started, the way I look at it, it was started from, at least the theory or the myth is, a king who was trying to kill the prince. He was trying to give him poison, or that was what was heard. So that prince took a little bit of poison every day and try and build up a certain amount of immunity to it. But homeostasis is a theoretical phenomenon of a dose-response relationship in which something like a heavy metal or an ionizing radiation that can produce harmful biological effects at moderate to high doses may produce beneficial effects at low doses. Again, bottom line, something that could be like a poison, really deleterious to your health at a higher dose. But if you get a stress at a lower dose, really gets a double thumbs up for health. So for instance, a little bit of stress, homeostasis, you decrease reactive oxygen species, you decrease your insulin, you increase your IGF-1. You're going to have a release of BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factors. Those BDNFs are great for overall brain health. You're also going to have neuroplasticity and synaptic function increase, all leading towards well-being. Whereas if you get too much stress or you don't have the ability, you'll have maladaptation. You're not going to have that metabolic flexibility. You're going to have an increase in reactive oxygen species, an increase in insulin, a decrease in IGF-1, where you're going to lead to a decrease in BDNF. You're not going to have the neuroplasticity and synaptic function, and well-being will be decreased. So clearly, without question, you really want to look at some of the different ideas, and you want to look at some of the stressors. So this is a quick one. I wanted everybody to have a little overview of what metabolic flexibility is. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Tomorrow, 11 o'clock, we're going to be back on. We're going to be doing a dual podcast Facebook Live with Ryan Smith, and we're going to be talking about longevity and supplements that increase longevity. Hope to see everybody soon. Dr. Rob, always yours in health.